so what I find authors, whenever they switch over to try to dictate their stories, they hit their dictation function, it pops up, and their brain freezes. And they're like, how do I actually get fictional characters, fictional worlds out from my brain, out my mouth? And so that's what I work with authors on, because you are having to dig new neural pathways in your brain. You are having to train your brain and make that mental shift from dictating nonfiction to dictating fiction. So it is a different skill set. Even though it's still speaking your words, it's a different skill set. It's a different mental ability that you have to develop.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Sarah Elisabeth Sawyer about training the brain for fiction dictation, including the differences in approach for fiction versus nonfiction. Sarah describes the challenges authors face when transitioning to dictating fiction and offers practical advice for overcoming mental blocks. Sarah also highlights the flexibility of dictation, allowing authors to work in different environments and in shorter time blocks. And she discusses how dictation can improve other audio assets and can engage audiences in new ways. And now let's hear from Sarah Sawyer about training the brain for fiction dictation. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Sarah Sawyer. Hey, Sarah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Matty. So good to be on here. Thanks for having me.
I am pleased to have you here. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Sarah Elisabeth Sawyer is an author and writing instructor who helps authors struggling to master the tools and knowledge to become confident in writing their books. Sarah has published 19 books, 11 of which she wrote solely by dictation. And Sarah is also the host of the Confident Fiction Author podcast, which empowers authors to live their best creative lifestyle. And her Fictation Digital Course takes authors through the process of mastering dictation to write fiction. And I had invited Sarah on the podcast because I've talked to people in the past on the podcast about dictation, but I don't know that we've ever spoken specifically about dictating fiction. And I started thinking about this, and it feels very different for me. Like, I'm not a dictation person. I can imagine making more use of dictation for my nonfiction, but somehow for my fiction, I have like a mental block about that, regardless of the fact that in a way it would make more sense. Like, I can imagine dictation would be fabulous for people if they were writing very dialogue-heavy scenes, for example. Saying that out loud could be great. So when you're talking to people about dictation, do you feel like the advice you would give people is different for fiction than maybe if they were thinking about using it for nonfiction?
100%. It is completely different for fiction versus nonfiction. So a lot of us today are accustomed to dictating like text messages or emails. It's just faster. I think especially text messages these days, and you could just hit that and start talking. Or if you're taking story notes, something in a nonfiction form. And so what I find authors, whenever they switch over to try to dictate their stories, they hit their dictation function, it pops up, and their brain freezes. And they're like, how do I actually get fictional characters, fictional worlds out from my brain, out my mouth? And so that's what I work with authors on, because you are having to dig new neural pathways in your brain. You are having to train your brain and make that mental shift from dictating nonfiction to dictating fiction. So it is a different skill set. Even though it's still speaking your words, it's a different skill set. It's a different mental ability that you have to develop. So that's why I used to, whenever I started dictating fiction, I didn't just start dictating fiction. It took many years and many false starts. I would try and fail, and I would be like, my brain just doesn't work that way, because I would listen to podcasts and people would talk about, oh yeah, I'm writing 5,000 words an hour, or 20,000 words a day with dictation. And I'm like, I need to do that. I have to do this. I have to figure this out. And I would go to it and I would just freeze up like, okay, my brain just doesn't work that way. Great. It works for them, but I'm just not wired that way. And so I was convinced that I just didn't have the skill set or the ability to do that. And some people, they just were wired that way, and some people are not. And what I discovered on my own journey is that I was able finally to train myself to make that mental shift. And so that's why I'm teaching authors to shorten that curve so they don't spend years convinced that dictating their fiction won't work for them. So yeah, it is a different skill set.
So do you have different advice for people who are already dictating other things, nonfiction, or the examples you gave, like text messages and emails and things like that? Or if they're just starting dictation from scratch, like I'm not a dictator. So if I was saying, oh, I want to jump into dictating fiction, experimenting with that, what advice would you give me as someone totally new to dictation?
Yeah. So this is going to sound a little self-promo, but I would advise that people take my trainings, because that is really helping them make that shift. But there's a few books out there available on dictating fiction. I think the benefit of being around other authors who are doing it and trying to master it at the same time, there's just a lot of power in that community, in that effort of we're all having the same struggle and we're doing it together. But overall, I would say, as far as like someone like you who you're used to the tech with dictating, so you know how to get your dictation function up and going, you know how to speak your words and maybe speak punctuation. There's that big tug of war right now of, do we speak our punctuation or do we let AI insert it for us? And so I have my own teachings on that, which just in short, I encourage authors to speak their punctuation. But if you're just starting from there, you've already have some experience with dictating nonfiction. To make that mental shift, there are a couple of things you can do. One, I always encourage authors to practice first. So one of the things you can do is grab one of your books or grab one of your favorite authors and turn on your dictation function and begin reading that work out loud. So something that already exists, is published, it's fiction. So read something, like I said, it can even be your own work, even something that's not published that you have. And just read that out loud, read the punctuation, pay attention to your breathing, where you're putting in pauses, and remember that you can go slow. That's something that with dictation, authors are like, well, I started it. I have to go. I have to speak all these words. I have to get it down on the page because that's the point. I wanted to go fast with being able to dictate. And so I just encourage authors, when you're starting out, go slow. Feel free to pause your dictation function, like turn it off, let yourself kind of gather your thoughts and all, and then turn it back on to continue. But a good practice is just reading something out loud that is published fiction and seeing how it transcribes onto the page, and just viewing that as you're going along, just to get yourself accustomed to hearing the fiction words out loud. Get yourself used to hearing your own voice speaking those worlds of fiction, because that can be a real transition for authors. Is they just really don't like the sound of their own voice. And so when they're dictating, especially fiction, nonfiction, I don't think it bothers authors as much, but fiction just is so deeply personal, and it's so raw and emotional a lot of times that hearing it, your own voice speaking it out loud, can just feel very vulnerable for a lot of authors. So just allow yourself to ease into it, and don't expect yourself to just make that shift from, if you're currently typing 2,000 words of fiction a day, to be able to immediately begin dictating 2,000 words of fiction a day. Some authors do make that immediate transition and don't have a lot of obstacles, but I found more authors than not really need to ease into it and just take little steps into dictating their fiction.
I think that one of the reasons that I haven't pursued dictation is that I think that my storytelling brain works at about the speed of my typing. And so I think a lot of times what I hear people saying is that they've pursued dictation because they have all these ideas and they can't possibly type them as fast as they're coming into their head. And I think that the way I write is I'm doing a lot of editing before the words emerge into the world, regardless of what the method is that's going there. So I kind of don't have that incentive. I don't think it would speed me up. I think I would produce words at the same rate, even if I got very good and facile at dictation as I am typing. But what I can imagine for other people who are in that position is that it would be a great pave the way in a good way for audiobooks. So even if an author isn't planning on narrating their own audiobook, and I have to say I'm not a huge fan of authors narrating their own fiction, because I think that there's a whole different skill set there, a whole acting skill set that's really necessary. But it could be a way to kind of try that out. If you feel comfortable saying the words in dictation, you might feel more comfortable performing those words in audiobook. But I can also imagine it just helps keep you from writing those words that are going to look great on the page but don't sound good. Have you had the experience of using dictation as a way of kind of better understanding the words that you're putting out there in the world and how they're going to be absorbed in different formats?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just speak to this on a couple of points that you made there with the audiobooks. I've heard of audiobook narrators, so not just the author trying to narrate their own book, but audiobook narrators love to perform a dictated story, one that was, and I'm talking first draft. So with dictation, great for first draft. Editing phase, revision phase, you can use some dictation in it. But when I talk about dictation, it's primarily to get that zero draft or that first draft down. That said, then you go in and do your edits. By the time it's published and ready to go to an audiobook narrator, they really love if a book was dictated, because it makes it a lot easier to perform, a lot more natural. like you said, dialogue, which we don't write like real life dialogue in fiction anyway, but we do still, like I said, we put words out there. Sometimes we put words in our characters' mouths, typed words that if you actually spoke that out loud, it wouldn't sound right. We're like,
Yeah.
like that's not really a word someone would use in a conversation. So I think it's definitely beneficial for that. And I would say this too, what you were saying, Maddie, about, your speed, that you pretty well type at the speed that you think. So with dictation, a lot of authors are drawn to the speed, like they want to be able to write faster. What I have found though, I've taught over 800 authors now dictation, is that about half of them are really coming to it for health issues. So it's not a matter of just being able to write faster. They're like, I'm not going to be able to continue my author career unless I can dictate because I have wrist issues, I have back issues, I have eyesight issues, I have these things that are on me now, arthritis and all. And one author recently, she went through an amputation and with her arm. And so like she needs to be able to dictate. So a lot of authors are coming to it for being able to sustain their career. So the benefits of writing faster, definitely there, but it's all the other benefits. It's health. It's what you said with audiobooks, more natural sounding dialogue. It's being able to do other things. You're not chained to your desk. My fastest writing is when I'm just laying in bed or laying on the couch and I'm just like in a very relaxed, comfortable position. I don't have any pressure on my neck or my shoulders or my back. And I'm really being able to take care of my health. Or I'm walking. A lot of authors like to go out for a walk and be able to dictate. I've done it while doing dishes or playing with puppies. So it allows you to get your writing in those smaller spaces of time that are just impossible to type, or you just wouldn't be able to get your writing in. And so there's that benefit of not only writing faster, but health and just being able to write in smaller pockets of time and get your word count in each day that you're wanting to get in with the lifestyles that we have. So really, that was the first time I wrote. My first dictated fiction scene was a piece of backstory that I wasn't planning to publish. And I had to get out the door. I had about 20 minutes. I also had dirty dishes in the sink. And I knew, one, I would not be able to type the scene in 20 minutes. Like I wasn't that fast of a typer. And it was just all downloaded in my brain. And so I plugged in my earbuds, which I don't recommend using earbuds for dictation, but I get into mics and tools and stuff in training. But I plugged in my earbuds and I used that to just capture this scene. And I came back and transcribed it. And I had over 1,200 words in that 20 minutes. And that's when I realized the power of dictation, not only to write faster, but be able to do it in those little pockets of time. And that's when I made the decision that whatever it took for me to fully train myself to dictate my fiction, I was going to do that. And I've dictated every first draft since then.
I know you're going to talk a little bit about tech later, but one of the things you mentioned is one of the reasons that dictation hasn't worked for me yet, because there are two times I would want to be using dictation. One is when I'm walking and I have leashes in my hands. I can't be like turning a recorder on and off.
I like how it's plural, leashes.
Yes, exactly. And the other is in the car. Like a couple of times a year, I take a long drive and it's a 13-hour trip, and I would love to be able to be dictating during that time. And over the last couple of years, I probably had a couple of people on the podcast talking about dictation. I ask this question every time, and I'm like, has the technology caught up yet? Because what I really want is a mechanism where it will be voice activated. So for the long periods of time when I wouldn't be saying anything, it wouldn't be recording. And then when I talk, it would record it. And I've tried probably 3 different setups with dictation trying to achieve that and have not been able to. Can you give us a little preview of some tech that might help address that if it exists now?
I think having a voice activated is phenomenal. So I have not personally come across an app like that, but I could see an app that, like a recording app, where you could, whenever you started speaking, it started recording, and you stopped speaking, it stopped recorded. So stop and start. What I would recommend for that with driving, because I don't know of a specific app with that. I mean, you can talk to Siri. You can say, hey, Siri, open this app, and she'll open it. But as far as like starting a recording, I've never done that. I always give a lot of cautions with driving and dictation. I always encourage authors to do it safely. One of the ways is to have your phone mounted. So have it mounted in your air vent or on your dash so that it's up and it's hands-free, where you could have, say, your recorder app open there and you can manually start and stop it. So you're able to hit record and do your dictated words and then hit pause, do some more thinking, and then start it again. So I'm not aware of a voice activated one, but that's where tech needs to go. I 100%, I know my authors would love that. And I've not come across it. I've not had anyone bring it up, but I do recommend you have a hands-free option. And some authors are able to just do it over the Bluetooth speakers of their car. So, and then some will go ahead and get a headset mic. And I also recommend for those who are outlining, I had one author in my VIP session that she was doing that for her commute. And she was like, but I can only make it about 15 minutes and then I have to stop and I can't remember the rest of my outline and where the scene was supposed to go. And so what I recommended to her is that she record her outline and have it where she could easily access it to play that recording, let it play. Again, just keeping your eyes on the road, but so have everything recorded where you can listen to your outline and then go back to your record device. So there are apps that will record for a long period of time. So if you did have times that you're going to pause, it's not going to go down. So if you have just a recording app, you may have 5-minute stretch that's just dead, but then you could begin speaking again and your recording is still going and it could potentially go for hours. So, and you may want to stop and save that. I always encourage authors, take those pauses, save your recording and start a new one. But that's something that could possibly work for you, Matty, is just having a recording app that will record even the blank stretches and then pick back up again and have your phone plugged in while it's there mounted on your dash so your battery doesn't run out on you.
Yeah, I do have a software, Descript, which is what I use to edit the audio and video of the podcast, and that would automatically take out dead air. So that would be good. I could feed it into Descript and it would take out all that. And I did find, I know at one point, I can't remember, this was years ago, I can't remember if it was an actual recorder or the app. I did find a voice activated one, but it wasn't sufficiently accurate. And then the other problem I've run into is ones where I think this is just user error, that rather than pausing, it like starts a new recording. So if I pause it 20 times, I end up with 20 individual files. Super annoying to deal with. But yeah, I do feel like this is not rocket science, so to speak. Like this should be out there if some vendor would just come through with it.
Yeah. And what I have found with authors, and this is what I do in my full Fictation course, is I spend an hour or two just on the tech tools because some authors have Android, some have iPhone, some want to do it on their PC, some on their Mac, and some have older versions and some have newer versions. And these tools, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of universal tools. Like it's going to behave differently depending on the device and the software that you have. So we spend a lot of time working through tech issues because that kept me for many years from dictating. And a lot of authors still think they have to purchase Dragon Dictation and spend that $600-700 on Dragon. And I tell them, no, I've never owned Dragon. I've never used Dragon beyond, a trial version on my phone that I didn't use for very long. But there are a lot of options out there. And so I really, that's one of my things is I like working with authors as personally as I can to get what works for them, like what works for them, like you in your specific situation, like we would sit down and hammer it out and just try to figure out what kind of setup would work best for you with your setup, with what you're wanting to do with dictation. So yeah, there's a lot to it, but if you're persistent and once you get past those hurdles and get something that works for you, it's just one of those things, there's no looking back. Like I love dictating now and I'm so grateful I pushed through all of those obstacles to be able to dictate all of my fiction to enjoy all the benefits beyond writing faster.
Yeah, the thing that has worked best for me, and this is strictly just for like notes, I'm not dictating content. This would be like, don't forget to pick up milk on the way home or whatever.
Yeah.
But opening up an email on my phone and dictating using the dictation feature just into the email and then emailing itself to me. Because honestly, I periodically try to use Siri and either Siri and I just don't get along at all. For some reason, she thinks I swear a lot more than I do. So like once it's transcribed, I'm like, there's like a lot more profanity in this transcript than I'm sure I said, regardless of the leashes that I'm holding. So yeah, I think what you're saying is right, that people shouldn't try one setup and then have a bad experience and decide that they're going to stop because there are probably as many alternatives out there as there are dictators who are looking for solutions.
Yes. Absolutely.
Are there other aspects you want to talk about regarding tips for getting over the mental blocks of dictating fiction?
Yeah. So beyond practicing it, so we talked about making the transition from nonfiction to fiction. So I would talk to authors who maybe they haven't dictated at all, like they've never touched, that they didn't even realize that you could dictate just using the default built-in program on your phone. You could just go into notes or an email or text message and hit that dictation function and start dictating. So that's where we usually start with authors is we start them on nonfiction. just to get used to the tech aspects, to get used to speaking their words out loud, to make sure they've got something, tools that work for them. And so, as far as tips with authors just getting started, like I encourage them to start there. Once you're starting to make that transition, practice and don't look at it again that you have to match your typing speed or your typing amount. Alternate. Do some typing, do some dictating, do some typing, do some dictating to get yourself accustomed to speaking your fiction out loud. One author I know as well, she'll be typing and she'll be talking out loud at the same time. She's not recording herself as with dictation or anything. She's just getting used to feeding those words out her mouth as they're coming out her fingertips. And I have seen this with myself and with the authors that I train. Dictation can become as natural to you as typing. So that's just an encouragement for authors, just like you hitting the return key, you're hitting the shift, you're capitalizing, you're putting in your punctuation, you're putting in your new paragraphs, you're creating these story worlds and these dialogues and action scenes and all of these things that you do with typing that you don't think about. It just automatically comes out your fingers. I really believe that you can make it, based on my own experience, you can make it as natural for those things to come out your mouth as they do your fingertips. And it can become as natural to you as typing.
I can imagine another way that I could get past this mental block I have about dictation is that, and this is tying in, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about each of our podcasts and the fact that I have an interview podcast, you have a solo podcast, and why that was appealing to each of us. And I think part of it is that this idea of dictating, it's like doing a solo podcast. It feels very uninspirational to me. But I can imagine having a scenario like, in the best case, you would have some good-natured friend that you could set up a Zoom with, and they would get on the phone and you would tell them your story, and they would be a good audience. And you could be either recording things like dialogue, or you could be recording things like, this is what I want to have happen in the scene, realizing that maybe most of us don't have friends that are quite that good or that patient with us. I can imagine just opening up a Zoom and doing the same thing, like just telling yourself the story.
Yeah.
And because I do sometimes think that people have gotten comfortable with that kind of interaction in a way that maybe they haven't with holding the phone up to their mouth or holding the microphone up to their mouth or plugging in the earbuds and talking to themselves. Have you ever experienced that as a way of like getting over that hump of into dictation?
Yeah. So I just created a brand new workshop that I was using as a bonus for my course. And I think I titled it How to Dictate Without Losing Your Author Voice. So I created that. And because I had this come up in my one of my trainings, that an author said, and she's a multi-published author, Indy Author, and she was saying that she turned in her dictated manuscript to her editor, her first dictated manuscript, and her editor asked, who wrote this? Like, this is not your voice and all of that. So that really concerned me, because that was something I paid a lot of attention to, because I was in the middle of a series, an established series, when I made the transition to dictation, and I was concerned that it would, interfere with my author voice. So and I checked with my readers. I just let them give me feedback. They absolutely loved the books that I dictated in that. No one made any comments about the change in style. And so when that issue came up, I started thinking about, well, why didn't I lose my author voice? Like, that wasn't an issue for me. And I think it's because I had storytelling training, oral storytelling. So what you were saying as far as like telling your story to someone else. So way back, I guess in 2009, 2010, I got involved with a storytelling organization, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with it as an art form. I really admired the people who were able to stand up there and tell a story and just capture the audience for 20, 30 minutes, an hour, and not children, like adult audiences. And so it was really, I didn't end up pursuing that as like a career or an art form, but I did do some of that. And I think the act of what you were saying, being able to tell your story to someone and getting used to that it's going to an audience can make a huge difference. And so that was what I included in that training, is to do some oral storytelling. Even if, like you said, doing it with a friend is great, doing it in an organization like Toastmasters, which I did. And another option is just recording it on video and publishing it on YouTube. So even though you're doing it solo, if you just had the video up, you're there and you know it's going to go to an audience, and you are performing it like like you're doing it to an audience, can give you that engagement in that sense that your spoken words are eventually going to reach an audience. If you want to do it live, you can do it live on social media as well, or through YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. Like, you can go live and do storytelling. So I think what you said, I think that's a great suggestion for authors who are looking for a more engaging experience besides just sitting there and dictating their words at 7 o'clock in the morning, like I do, solo in my chair before anybody else gets up. If you are looking for more engagement and interaction and preserving your author voice when you're dictating it, that storytelling is a great way to do that. And you can just use your own stories. So a story that you've written, a flash fiction or something, and just do that with your audience, and then eventually move into you're now dictating fresh story worlds.
I can imagine someone who has a certain kind of storytelling style really building a whole ecosystem around this. They could have a whole community of people where, every morning at 7 a.m. they were going to hop on a YouTube Live and they were going to dictate a chapter. And then after they were done, they would look through the comments and they would see what people's comments were and what people really liked or didn't like. And then they would deliver the polished version of that to their followers. This could be like a Patreon or a Kickstarter.
I was going to say that would make
a
great Patreon, right?
Yeah. I really like this idea of, dictation sounds so like, I don't know, somebody that in the 50s, they would invite the secretary into the office to sit down and take. And I think this idea of framing it more as it's just an audio, it's just another format. It's not like a administrative task, which I think is subconsciously the perspective that I have had that has maybe stood in my way.
Yeah. So authors have been dictating since there were kings and scribes. So, the king did not write down all of his commands and stuff, like he dictated them to someone. So like you said, like a secretary. But fiction authors have been dictating for a long while as well. I think about someone shared with me Paradise Lost by John Milton. He dictated that epic poem because he was blind, and he dictated it for, I think, his nieces and nephews. And then Barbara Cartland, I believe is her name. She dictated some 700 books. And she had a private secretary who took them down. So then we moved into the age of dictaphones, and some of the current authors that we're familiar with they started with dictaphones, and they would mail the recording to a human transcriber who would transcribe it and send back like that to where we're at now, where you can still do that. But we have tools now that we can just speak and our words immediately appear on the page. And so it's become a very cost-effective way. So whereas Barbara Cartland having a private secretary was, of course, quite costly. When someone's sending off your manuscript, you're looking at probably $1,000 by the time you finish with your dictated manuscript. That's what that would cost you. The cost came down with Dragon Dictation. A lot of authors jumped on that. And now we're at the point where a few dollars or even just free options to be able to dictate. So it's really opened it up for fiction authors to be able to enter this without having a private secretary. But yes, dictation is not anything new. It's been around for thousands of years.
One thing I'm interested in is how the editing process works. If you've dictated a first draft and now you're going through and you're polishing it up, do you find that the experience of that is different once you are working with a dictated first draft rather than a written out manuscript? Written out first draft?
Sure, as far as like typing. So the thing with me, I did not find a big difference, other than I will say sometimes I would write a little bit more because I was dictating. The words were coming easier. And sometimes I would write less, though. I am a heavy editor. So my first drafts are pretty lean and mean. I don't like to do a lot of description. I leave myself a lot of notes. And what I discovered, honestly, Matty, is that my typed first drafts and my dictated first drafts were pretty similar. If I didn't feel like writing description whenever I was typing, I probably didn't feel like writing description when I was dictating. Like I wanted to get onto the action and the scene. The key difference is, and this is something that I really harp on with my authors, is you have to do your cleanup. So after you dictated your words, you need to go back through and do not an edit, but just a cleanup. So correcting any errors that were made during the transcription process, which I train authors how to be more accurate so they aren't having a big mess, because when I started, I was about 50-50. So if I spent 30 minutes dictating, I had to spend 30 minutes in cleanup, which was producing about the same amount of words as typed, because I doubled my writing speed with dictation. I went from 1,500 words an hour to 3,000 words an hour. But at the beginning, I was having to do a lot of cleanup. As I got better with my dictation and better with my methods and my training, it went down to about 90-10. So I could spend 55 minutes dictating, or 10 minutes on my cleanup and I was done and I had my 3,000 words. So what I do tell authors is do your cleanup right, like budget that into your writing session. So if you're going to write for an hour, leave yourself time in that hour to do your cleanup because the goal is to have the as clean of a first draft as if it was typed. So it's still a messy first draft, but it's clean as far as all of the any dictation errors, if it transcribed the word incorrectly. So you want to, whenever you go into that editing time, you have the same kind of draft that you would as if you had typed it. So I know one author, what turned him off of dictation until he came back into my boot camp or came into it for the first time is he did dictate an entire novel. And then he went back to do the edits and it was such a disaster. He was like, I'm never going to do that again. And I said, yes, you must do your cleanup as you go along, not getting into editing, like it's not edit as you go, but you do when you finish your writing session, you want to just do a quick read, just a speed read through it and not even reading it. You're just looking for some errors, cleaning those up and then putting it away and going on with your normal routine.
And do you find that the flags that something like Word or Scrivener put up or Pro Writing Aid, if people are using things like that, would that facilitate the kind of editing that you're talking about?
Yeah, it definitely can. So I dictate, my method now is I dictate directly into my Scrivener iOS app, which Scrivener users, you have to have an iPhone. Unfortunately, they only offer it for iOS, but I dictate directly into Scrivener. And so since it's on my phone, I'll get those blue squiggly lines where it's like suggesting, did you mean were or were? And so I'll tap that and it'll give me that, or it auto capitalize something that shouldn't have been capitalized, or it'll just have incorrect words. So I do find clicking on those little or tapping on those little blue squiggly lines help. I don't typically do cleanup on my phone though, because it does take longer, fat thumb trying to get stuff like right where it needs to be. I'll usually transfer over to my computer to do my cleanup, but I do find I have Grammarly on my computer. So I do find that helps, especially like with emails. I do have that turned off of Scrivener because it gets a little bit too much into suggestions, into editing suggestions. And so I do a lot of my cleanup manually. Some authors are using ChatGPT to do their cleanup. I have a lot of caution around that because it will actually change your words that you wrote. So you have to put a lot of parameters, a lot of safety safeguards around that. And that's not something that I teach or encourage, but it is an option for authors with their cleanup. But I currently manually do my cleanup. And it also gives me a chance just to reconnect with my story because I do enjoy reading back through what I just wrote. I always do just appreciate like checking out the scene that I just wrote, and it kind of sets me up for the next scene. So I do that, but I just really avoid getting into heavy edits with that. But some tools like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid can give you some suggestions and make your cleanup a little faster.
So we've been talking a lot about if people want to dive into dictation sort of new, but I'm sure there are going to be some listeners who have been dictating for a long time. They're old hands at it. Are there any kind of tips that you'd like to share with them? Like a couple of sort of graduate level tips or discoveries that you've made recently that you think have really paved the way for you or for other more experienced dictation people to do that work?
Yeah. One of the things I encourage authors is when they're starting out, just find one tool that works for you. Don't get overwhelmed with experimenting with too many different things. But if you're advanced with your dictation, do try new things. Do check your process and find out, is there a faster way or a better way of doing this now? I used to do what I call the record and transcribe method. So I would record all of my words and then the app would transcribe them. And then I would have to copy and paste those into my notes app and then go over to my notes app and copy and paste those into Scrivener. And then there they were. So it was a clunky process. I wrote 9 books that way though, and it was a great process. But so for authors who are dictators who, are experienced with dictating your fiction, check your process and see if maybe there's an easier way to do it now. As we were talking about, there's always new tools. There's always new methods that you can try that maybe will make your process smoother. And the other thing is just really check your location, check your health with your doing it. If you've always done it at your computer, maybe try doing it on your phone. Maybe try walking if you've never walked and dictated before. If you've never tried it with driving or in a coffee shop. A lot of authors are like, oh, it's too noisy. That won't work. With new technology today, like my phone, it zooms in on my voice and it like cancels out the background noises and all. So even if the espresso machine is going, you might be able to dictate in the coffee shop and maybe you've missed that. Maybe you've been dictating for years and you just always do it at your home, at your desk, or in a certain way in a certain spot. So try something different and see if you find something that you really enjoy with your writing process and helps you not only be more productive, but just makes it a more enjoyable experience and smooth things out. So just really examine your process of what you're doing with your dictation.
Great. Well, Sarah, thank you for sharing tips for both the newbies and the more experienced folks with dictation. I like the conversation we had about how thinking of it as you just audio content, not maybe getting away. If the term dictation is what is turning people off, then just think of it as an audio interaction instead of a tactile interaction, I guess. So you'd mentioned a couple of times you have some resources for people. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and the resources you offer online.
Absolutely. So fictioncourses.com is my site. So if you go to fictioncourses.com/dictation, I have a couple of free resources for your audience. I have a dictation guide. So it's kind of a quick start guide with some tools and tips of the trade. So I have a few apps in there and some methods and a punctuation key that you can follow along with if you're just getting started. If you're just getting started, or if you're a little more advanced and you're a Scrivener user, I do have a free mini course called Dictation plus Scrivener Power Combo. And you can get that at fictioncourses.com/dictation as well. So you can go get both of those. Those are free resources. And then I do teach my live dictation bootcamp for authors a couple of times a year. It's a great time for 100 plus authors. I had over 400 authors in my October dictation bootcamp. So it's just a great live event. We have a Facebook group. We get on Zoom. I teach methods, and then I send you off with an assignment to apply what you're learning as you go along to really take your first steps in dictation. And then I also have my full course is called Fictation, and it's the robust guide to guiding you through dictating at whatever level you're at. So I spend a lot of time in tools, a lot of times in making that mental shift from typing your words to speaking them. So those are all over at fictioncourses.com/dictation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sarah. Have you ever tried dictating your writing? What has been your biggest challenge or success when using dictation as part of your writing process? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.